Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Kyte Talks. Today, the subject of today is another one close to my heart, and that's gaming. And ever since gaming came to Malta, we were always there helping operators obtain the license and performing audits for the regulator. And a lot has changed since then. Like I said, our roots, our history is rooted in gaming, but a lot has changed since then. And I look forward to today's discussion where we're talking about these changes, matters of compliance, and a little bit of information security for good measure. My name is Trevor Axiak. I'm the director at Kyte Global. And today's guests are also very much involved in gaming and have been in the industry for as long as I have, probably more. And I can honestly say they've seen it all. So I'll start by introducing them. We have Sandro Borg, who is the head of technical compliance at Evoke PLC. They're operators of 888 and William Hill. We have Donald Tabone, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at Betsson. And we have Alexandra Simões, who is the Head of Compliance here at Kyte. Guys, thank you very much, first of all, for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So I start as what has become almost customary with an icebreaker, which is about typical challenges that we face in our, let's say, day-to-day work. And I start with you, Alex. So based on your experience in helping clients and assisting them with the licenses, with all aspects of compliance, what are typically those things which you find in common in terms of, let's say, weaknesses of operators, or I should say areas where you typically see that they need the most help?
That's a very, very good question to start with, especially. So on our day-to-day work, we find ourselves assisting our clients from scratch with brand new license applications, as well as with small matters of compliance where they need our support. But I believe across all these types of involvement in the industry, one shortcoming would be, to start with, the lack of preparation in terms of the requirements. So the applicant or the licensee does not really know what to expect, which is great because there are great consultants in the market, but not being prepared on this aspect, I believe, creates room for a lot of resources which are not in place for this. So once they have a plan which is very, very well put together from a business perspective, unfortunately, the lack of resources and the lack of knowledge drags them a bit back in their process. And so, for example, a practical example, when someone comes to us for a license, not knowing what we have to put together in terms of the policies and procedures, for example, and in terms of what they have to give us, creates a huge backlog in the application. And so once we prepare, for example, the policies and procedures for our clients, we still need a lot of their input. We need to know what will be the flow of the operations. We need to know what systems they have in place, what integrations they prepared or they are going to use. Without this, we cannot prepare a good document for them. And so them having not prepared systems and not prepared teams on this aspect does not really enable us to do a good job.
Yeah. And I would imagine it's not a case of the operators typically not being well prepared in terms of their own internal controls, right? We're talking about probably operationally things are okay, but when it comes to compliance matters, they need help.
Certainly, and it goes to even a higher superficial level. For example, the lack of documentation. So the moment when they have a process, a flow of operations in place, which is established and works compliant with all the regulations, they don't have that documented. And so by not having even the personnel to enable us to document that for them, it's really difficult for us to pinpoint the most important parts of their operations in order to properly document them.
Yeah, I can imagine documentation seems to be something nobody really, especially within the IT context, nobody wants to be documenting. That everyone wants to be implementing, but not documenting. Okay, I'll turn to you, Sandro. You're on the other side of the coin. You're the one implementing, or at least putting in place the necessary controls. But you also come from an environment where you have multiple licenses, right? Across even more number of jurisdictions. So whatever Alex has been saying is what she sees in terms of assisting with the licensing. Your job is a little bit harder because multiply that by so many other jurisdictions. So typically, what sort of challenges would you face in having to deal with multiple licenses, multiple jurisdictions, and multiple locations, probably where your staff are located as well?
I think the biggest challenge we face is always resources. So whether it's HR resources, whether it's technical, whether it's development, we struggle a lot with resources, and we never have enough resources to cope with everything that is incoming from the various jurisdictions that we are operating in. So whether we're applying for a license or we're trying to fix a problem, or launching in a new market, whatever it is, we end up normally facing very tight deadlines, and consequently we have to prioritize one project versus the other, and one jurisdiction versus the other. And because of this, sometimes we have to let go of some less important tasks, or go in a bit more, try to approach a problem in a faster way, which is not exactly ideal. We end up sometimes relying on third-party systems, which at the end might prove a bit costly or problematic at a later stage. And sometimes we're not agile enough. Apart from that, there are a number of similarities in the different jurisdictions that we operate, but they all have their own distinct features. So in the detail, or at face value, something is similar to what we have in another jurisdiction, but in another jurisdiction, it could be different in the detail. And sometimes during the analysis or during the design, when we're trying to accomplish something, we end up building something which does not exactly meet what we were trying to meet. We also have sometimes problems when, for example, a system is built to handle a control in one way, but then to design that a similar control for another jurisdiction, we have to do additional development and changes to be able to meet the requirements of the other jurisdiction.
Yeah. Donald, I'll turn to you on a similar subject, but you look at things from the information security side of things. Yes. But you're also coming from an environment where you have so many different regulatory frameworks that you have to deal with. Would you consider, would you say from your experience that at least the information security requirements, and not just now compliance requirements, but information security requirements are common, possibly conflicting in some ways?
Well, from a challenge point of view, to answer your question, for sure, I completely align with Sandro on that, on his points. I think there are various problems sometimes in relation to the interpretation of certain requirements. Sometimes they're not even clear. Sometimes they're vague. And so, the interpretation of such a requirement comes down to us, and then things change, and then at one point you say, oh no, that's not acceptable, and we have to sort of circle back. So there's that. There's a challenge of alignment sometimes, whereby requirements are set forth, and then people get working to comply to that control or to that requirement, and then somewhere along the line they misalign, right? And that causes problems. Sometimes clarity is also an issue, whereby a report is needed for compliance reasons, and it's not really clear, the structure of that report, or perhaps the dates, or any parameter related to this same compliance. But from an InfoSec angle, we're not short of all of this, because in reality, when we're talking about controls, we're talking about security controls or other requirements of a jurisdiction that need to be there, like reporting, for example. And we're no stranger, obviously, to that. And honestly, there's no real harmonization. They try to model their requirements on the basis of standards. That doesn't always work out. In some cases, they exceed the requirements of a standard, making it so much more difficult, and sometimes not. Some jurisdictions accept ISO certificates, for example, as a good base level. Others don't.
Despite the operational issues, though, of having to comply, but in terms of the actual requirements themselves, in the same way that obviously we work within PCI, ISO, a bunch of other, fintech requirements, but they're all pretty much, the controls are pretty much the same, right? They all wear them in a different way. They all are responsible for their own frameworks, their own standards.
For the most part, yes.
But would there be controls that in some way, like, listen, we've been asked to do it in this way, and now this other regulator wants us to change things to do it in a completely other way? Or in general, things are pretty much consistent?
In general, they are consistent, but there are, for example, the Spanish regulator has requirements which go over and above ISO. So they throw in their own flavor. And for that reason, I think the state of play is, honestly speaking, fragmented. There is no real harmonization, no single meter ruler, so to speak, that is used across, at least when it comes to InfoSec, that is used across all the regulators, and that causes a bit of a problem.
Okay, we're talking about regulations and different jurisdictions. What about unregulated markets, Alex? This is a little bit of a hot topic in the sense that, operating within unregulated markets carries its own, not just challenges, risks, right? First of all, when we say unregulated markets, what are we talking about, and what sort of risks would we expect?
So, as Donald also mentioned, the unregulated markets are less and less available. So more of them, they start their own regulatory framework, and we are losing them, and they are very interesting. However, indeed, they do carry a lot of risks. We look here at risks in relation to the reputation, to financial risk. It's, by the way, an immediate impact risk. We have less control without a framework within which we have to fit a certain process. And so the damages can be at times irreparable, unfortunately. Nonetheless, of course, most of the operators still go for it, and it's a hot topic still. But I'm really, really proud to see that a lot of our clients are oriented towards the regulated markets, and they strive to obtain licenses accordingly. But unregulated markets are still very, very...
Unregulated markets, though, there's a complete difference to what is illegal, right?
Absolutely. The moment when you target new jurisdiction, you have to first of all obtain a legal opinion. Now, that comes on the basis of your potential over there and your permission over there. You have to, of course, check whether the market is regulated or not, meaning there is a regulator in place and there is a framework which you have to follow. But there is also the option where the actual product which you're going to offer in that market, it's prohibited, it's illegal over there. And so, of course, that's not about being regulated, it's about by being not permitted at all in the first place. And that's a far more important offense than just by mistake, let's call it so, you operate somewhere where you should have obtained the license in the first place.
Yeah, it seems like it's a market for lawyers and legal teams, right? Because you're constantly navigating jurisdictions where, and we know because clients keep asking us like, okay, so if I get a license from that country or in Malta itself, like, where can I operate? And our answer is always like, it depends, right? Because probably things have changed since yesterday. Some some countries are, there's a ban, right? It's illegal. Others have introduced their own regulations, which requires a license in that country. From 27, you go up to 28, right? So yeah, it seems like it's a challenge and the question which we can never answer, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. And in addition to this, I would also mention that the moment when you try to penetrate an unexplored market for you, you have to assess the risks. And at times, even though, yes, they are important, they are dangerous, let's say, there are risks which you can choose to actually accept, right? And you can even implement, for example, some controls which would help you in potentially mitigating or like protecting the interest of the business ultimately, you know? And so being well informed prior going for this can be a huge game changer in the operations.
I mean, we do something very similar to this on the opposite side of the fence. Clearly, even you, I imagine, Sandro, in your company, but we do a lot of this initial homework, and we look at the geography, we look at the technologies in that specific jurisdiction. We look at, of course, the legal side of it, and then, of course, everything is put together, and you decide whether you want to operate in what we call a gray market. Right? Gray market means that it's not black, it's not white. Somehow, if you operate in there, you sort of tolerate it for better or for worse. So I think to dovetail with what you said, Alex, it comes out to risk. It's how much are you willing to risk. It takes time and effort to spin up a new product, a new brand in a new jurisdiction with games and so on and so forth. So clearly there's capital outlay, and you're risking that. Right? But you're also risking reputation. So if things go south for whatever reason and governments tend to change, then things can go south very, 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 very quickly. On the other hand, you could be the first to be operating in a country that then decides to legislate. So it's great.
Yeah.
And I think it's very good to distinguish. So I agree with Alex and Donald about unregulated versus grey, because I don't like to use the word unregulated at all, because normally everyone who operates in a sort of legal way has some sort of license, yes, for which there is some regulator.
Correct. Yes.
Of course, some regulators regulate in one way, others regulate differently. But there always is something sort of that is trying to protect the player, or requiring certain controls to be there and in place. But of course, each company, as my colleague said, they have to do a risk assessment. Is it profitable or is it worth to stay in this market? Because sometimes we are already in that market and we start to hear, about the upcoming framework. So sometimes one needs to take care of it.
Donald mentioned harmonization at international level, which seems to be, whether it happens or not, seems to be the direction or the interest of at least some in some parts of the world, let's say. Can this work, you think?
in theory, it can work, and it would be beneficial for operators and possibly for regulators as well. In practice, I think this is very far from ever happening properly. Maybe at some point it will happen between a few jurisdictions, but there's a lot of differences between the ideas of the regulators. There's politics involved. We have to keep in mind as well, the regulators also have a manpower problem. They are limited in resources, so they cannot always assign as much people to work on such a project as they would wish. So it would be beneficial. Operators would massively benefit from this, but I don't see it happening in the next few years.
Briefly, the thing about it, Trevor, is that you can put down requirements and make them as stringent as you want, but the more stringent you make them, then the more you're limiting how many people actually start applying for licenses in that jurisdiction. So, and here we come to the harmonization problem, that a country just wanting to introduce legislation is probably not going to be so tight initially because it wants to attract licensees. On the contrary, if you've been there for a while, and like the UK, just to mention one of them, right, the UK GC, if you've been there for a while and you've been seeing problems and you've been hearing, and there have been lobbies of people, responsible gaming and all of that, you start thinking to yourself, maybe we should start tightening up. And that's exactly what they did. They tightened until at one point the company, and I'm talking as someone on the opposite side of the fence here, starts to sort of say, hey, is it still worth it to operate in this specific jurisdiction because the requirements have become too tight? And I'm talking about InfoSec, I'm talking about AML, responsible gaming, and everything, and everything around those.
But has it really become too tight, or has it become too complex? Because in fintech it works, right? Or at least, whether I say it works, in fintech is probably a bit different, because obviously at a central level, regulations are harmonized, but then it's up to each, for example, in the EU member state to sort of enforce those. It's not the same thing in gaming, is it?
With the exception of the UK GC, you are right. But the UK GC is not that type of regulator. They are very strict on their requirements. They don't tolerate much deviation from non-compliance in all the respective areas. And I think it depends. It depends what's at interest. I know, Sandro, you mentioned politics, and unfortunately politics does come into it a lot. So do we want to squeeze out our existing license holders or not? And there are different techniques. So for example, Holland, just mention another jurisdiction, they have squeezed down how many licenses they issue within the country. So to get the license, it's like, but then keeping it is a different story. The bar is set to be very high. Not saying it's a good or bad thing here. Of course, this is. But
it's a decision that you need to face on a daily basis, I suppose. Alex, if harmonization could in some way ever work, cheeky question, like what would that mean for Malta? We're here, right? And we're based here, so it's of particular interest to us. How does that affect the country itself, as the regulator, and possibly service providers like ourselves?
Well, for Malta, I don't think it's going to be very impacting. In the first place, to consider the aspect of the current standards imposed by the regulator, which I would say they are pretty high to a certain level compared to other fellow regulators. However, I believe trying to bring them all at one unity level would just bring others to our the requirements, I would say, because I wouldn't call it mandatory level. It's how we look at things, and I believe Malta has a huge pro point, let's say, advantage in terms of the in the first place in terms of the history, because Malta was one of the first regulators, right, in the area, and so I think Malta has seen its all, let's say, until today. And they already cater for a lot of challenges which could come across.
Has had to adapt as well.
Absolutely. Let's remember 2018. It was a huge rewriting of the legislation. It was a huge change. And ever since, they always try to improve and to cater a bit better, of course, without compromising on the requirements for whatever difficulties they identified in the market. And they try to come also to the support of the applicants. But at the same time, of course, they maintain the standard in order to protect the authority, the national and the applicant's interest.
Donald, we mentioned already you operate in multiple jurisdictions, but you also hold certifications, ISO 7001, PCI DSS, and I can only imagine the effort involved in managing all those, but that might also mean you're in a constant state of audit, right? So at any point in time, if you mentioned 20 plus jurisdictions and certifications, you probably are like back to back in audits. How are you managing these audits, and are you getting any value from them?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, actually. So within the security sphere, obviously there's the GRC aspect, and the C is exactly that. It's about complying regulatory requirements, but also to certifications which we hold. As you correctly said, we're ISO 27001 certified since 2018 and PCI DSS certified since 2013. And of course, that keeps us on our toes. It also says something in terms of the level we want to maintain, and also how senior management sort of perceive and think a little bit about information security. So for them, what that brings to the table in terms of value is a certain way of doing things, structure. I think structure, if they really believe in it, in terms of value, it begins to work. The trick to it is, of course, the narrative that we use with various stakeholders within the company. So the narrative between me and the CEO is one thing, and the narrative between me and general security awareness training is a completely different story, right? But yes, for sure, the governance aspect from managing an ISMS, which is applicable across all jurisdictions, is a hell of a task, especially when you have findings coming from various different audits trickling in sort of at different times of the year. So you have to keep on top of that, some corrective action plans and so on and so forth. It is very, very challenging, because then on top of that, you have things like, ITGC audits, you have internal audits, and so on and so forth.
Sandro, I suppose the audits themselves are one way how the regulators are keeping track that controls are in place or requirements are being met. But in actual fact and in practice, from your experience, are the regulators actually enforcing controls as, let's say, information security best practices require, or is it a tick box?
From an information security perspective, I think while the regulators are sort of committed to having the right controls in place, the actual enforcement is another story. I've seen in the past some examples in which the regulator seemingly tried to implement some security requirements, for example, by adopting bits and pieces from ISO and from PCI, but somehow managed not to get it exactly right. So it's like when the regulations were drafted or the guidelines were drafted, the regulator wasn't exactly fully aware of what it was trying to achieve. But the commitment is there. Of course, we have to remember that the regulators, as I said before, have their own limitations as well. They are limited in resources. They cannot always control everything, and they cannot always monitor everything as well.
I mean, to add to that, I think we can also safely say that usually regulators depend on an external entity to perform the audit, right? And Correct. They rely on that.
Correct.
So usually they form an opinion based on
what they see in the certification report or in the security report. Correct.
Conducted by the external entity to them.
Yes.
So that's also something.
Yes.
That relates to resources.
We're talking about resources. Okay, this from the regulator's office point of view, but obviously the operators have the same challenges as has already been mentioned. Alex, and you work in this area as well, helping clients source the key roles, right? Which are mandatory requirements as per various regulations. I'm not talking from a recruitment point of view, but from fulfilling specific roles. First of all, which type of roles would lend themselves well to, let's say, potentially outsourcing them because these can't be sourced internally?
Well, there are a lot of benefits at certain stages in outsourcing. Most of them, they come when the operations are pretty limited in the beginning for startups, for not really great developed operations. But in general, across all the operators and the providers, we usually opt for outsourcing the internal audit, as that is an independent unit and you can't utilize that resource in any other scope but the actual internal audit exercise. And so for most of them, we noticed that they don't really have the need of a full-time or even a part-time, but all year round employee, right? And so contracting an outsourced individual for this grants you, of course, in the first place, the skills, the actual coverage, let's say, in terms of the role itself. So that individual will have a plan for you. You don't have to cater from your end the upcoming audit, the resources for it, allocating the team and everything. You will have the element coming from outside of your infrastructure. So that's a worry in minus, let's say, for your list. And in addition to this, there are a number of others which proved very, very beneficial to be outsourced for most of our clients, at least in my experience. We talk here about the key legal, for example, can be easily outsourced in terms of the key function. This does not mean that the actual licensee will not have, for example, a team of lawyers who will do perhaps the digging in terms of new jurisdictions, etc., etc. But the actual contact with the MGA and
the case of Malta, for example, but other regulators as well.
Absolutely. In the case of the actual contact with the regulator, I'm speaking, so not the work for the operations and for compliance, but the actual contact with the regulator. The key function by itself, it's usually beneficial to be outsourced. In addition to this, of course, a lot of them, due to the lack of skills available in the market, can make use, for example, of a very strong compliance officer as an outsourced individual. And other than this, I believe it would be honestly beneficial to have them in-house, to have the actual resources
for startups, I suppose, that are not necessarily startups in terms of knowledge of the industry, because probably they know the industry very well, but startups in terms of setting up, getting probably their first license. It might work to have certain functions outsourced, and then as they grow, they bring in those resources in-house.
Absolutely, that's the ideal scenario. However, unfortunately, that's really a continuous challenge and it's not always achievable. But from the beginning, it would be really, really advisable. For instance, let's take key technology as example. That would really be ideal to be from the beginning in-house, within the team, within the office environment, working closely with all the rest of the departments, because that's a key part. And I think having someone like that outsourced could create room for deficiencies rather than bringing actual value.
We'll talk about resources, Sandro. Obviously, training would be one such way of possibly dealing with the problem of resources, but continuous learning, I suppose, is key here to staying ahead. How do you manage within your team and possibly within the company itself, the concept and the culture of continuous learning and development to keep up with technology changes, regulatory changes, changes in the market?
First of all, we try to stay up to date with all the upcoming changes in the jurisdictions. This, of course, sometimes challenging. From a knowledge point of view, we try to keep always learning, whether it's a short course, whether it's a certification, whether it's formal training whenever it's required. We try to suggest that we point out or that our employees know where they can benefit from formal training or from any training, and we try to get our employees to go for such training.
I've noticed even the regulators are starting to impose requirements on the training aspect as well, right? Which is obviously every information security standard that I know, and even non-information security, have the concept, the requirement of training as one of the pillars, right? But now the regulators are also like pushing on this.
Yes,
right?
On certain topics such as AML, for example, and responsible gaming, there are regulators that enforce that all employees sort of, or not enforce, but have a requirement that all employees do mandatory training sort of once a year or something of this sort, or at least the employees that are in touch with that particular area.
I mean, from a security point of view, for sure, as you said, Trevor, there are, certifications like CISO and CISSP, which all require, even lead implementer of ISO 27001, and we require you to submit CPEs. So the question is, how many are you going to have of these, right? Because you do a course or you read something and you have to update 5 or 6 different portals if you have 6 certifications. So there's also the practical aspect. Exactly. So there's a practical aspect apart from the cost aspect, because it costs. But at least in the security side of things, I'm happy to say that nowadays there are master degrees, which is good on the security side of things. So at least you can expect to bring in people with a certain level of training, so to speak, certain level of knowledge, and then you continue to build on that. The problem when it comes to that is that sometimes there is a disparity between the learnings from a book and what really happens in real life. And there's such a big disparity that sometimes what I see with resources is like, I've done all these. I must be, a manager as soon as I start. And the answer is, quite frankly, no. I'm afraid, you have to pass through the practical side of things and then reach wherever you want to reach. So the learnings that I tend to sort of pass on to my guys or to my team are a lot from the practical aspect. You've been doing it for so long, you've perfected the recipe, and that's the recipe you want to push forward down to your people. It's structured, yes, but it's also very different from what a book will teach you.
My next question is in reverse, right? What you're passing on to your people, but let's talk about bottom up now. Your role is a CISO within a gaming company, right? Yes. First of all, how similar is that to a CISO in any other company or a bank, for example? And as an information security professional within a company, probably not the most popular person, right? Because of what you're constantly trying to drill into the culture. Are you managing to affect change?
Yes, I think it's a very good question, Trevor. And my style has changed over the years. I have to say that. Originally, I come from a very technical background. Now I have more of a business hat, right? And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, the narrative that I use with different people changes. So
you've learned diplomacy, right?
Exactly. So the question is, what do I bring to the table, right? When I'm sitting around with the rest of the chiefs, what does Donald bring to the table? Well, what I bring to the table is a certain amount of influence, right? Influence in what, right? In essentially essentially finding ways to protect the engine, so to speak, that is generating money, right? I remember, security doesn't necessarily generate money per se for a company. Instead, it offers a certain degree of protection to make sure that that same engine that is generating money continues to generate money. So ultimately, the value that I give back are insights with regards to, obviously, the risk management side of things, the governance, which I sometimes, yes, struggle to push through around, information security, compliance, and risk management. A degree of protection to some degree, because again, we don't always implement stuff ourselves, right? We sort of advise different parts of the business what they need to be doing, and then we sort of handhold them and retain oversight. So the value is exactly that. So as long as, in this case, the company I work for, from quarter to quarter, keeps making money, then Donald's team on the background is doing something right, because they are achieving their strategic objective of ultimately making money and preventing what I like to call unwanted human behavior. Because it's not systems that misbehave, it's humans that misbehave.
Guys, we're running out of time, but I want just maybe a small comment from all three of you. What should we expect in the near future in terms of trends, innovation, or changes within the industry? Sandro, start with you.
I think we will see a few more national self-exclusion systems. So a central system of the government in which players can exclude themselves. We will probably see also centralized deposit limit implementations as well. So when a player would set a deposit limit, for example, with operator A, through a common system, that deposit limit would be transposed to operator B. And what I think another two might be national player verification systems, in which the operator is sort of required to connect to the government system or the regulator system to verify the identity of the players. Plus, of course, the usual, I think, would be AI that many companies are trying to leverage to automate the most the tasks that it can actually automate, the ones that require a lot of resources, the ones that are repetitive, etc.
Yeah, Alex?
I couldn't agree more with you, and I believe this, in a way, it's the answer to the shortfall of the skills of the human availability, because in the end we have so many tasks and we are only this many. And yes, automating a number of the tasks, especially the repetitive ones, it's the key. I really expect seeing this in the immediate future. And I really believe there should be a higher reliance between regulators, because, as we discussed, more and more jurisdictions are becoming regulated markets. And so, of course, there is room for everyone. And it's definitely not a bad direction. However, there should be a high level of cooperation, let's say, between them. And they could rely one on the work that is done already by another. So I really hope there will be a lot of let's say, not overlapping in fulfilling the obligations towards different markets.
Okay, Donald?
What I'm seeing is I'm seeing legislation hit us, smack us in the face. I'm seeing NIS2. I'm seeing DORA hit us. I'm seeing cybersecurity acts popping up and mushrooming. So that will bring with it a certain, in a good sense, it will bring with it, a certain top-down approach, making security no longer optional. It never was in reality, but now that was, legislation sets that. For sure, I see AI in a bit of a pessimistic outlook, because I see that it's being used for the wrong reasons already. So we're no stranger to that. For social engineering attacks and for the wrong reasons also, when it comes to complexity of attacks. And that means that somehow, we need to respond in such a way which is on par to be able to stop these types of attacks. And then, of course, I'm also seeing the perimeters of information protection. I'm not calling it information security, information protection, which are constantly moving. I think we're pushing boundaries. People are moving to the cloud, less on premise. That for us, at least from a security point of view, represents a problem because there are no more borders anymore. So the question is, how do we keep control of AI? How do we keep control of the information that the company possesses? These are the questions that I see on the horizon, which are sort of keeping me up at night.
Well, if they don't, then you're not doing your job well, right? But clearly you are. Guys, thank you very much for joining me. This was a very interesting discussion. I wish we had more time. But once again, thank you for being here. Thank you everyone for watching, and we look forward to welcoming you again on another edition of Kyte Talks.